Welcome back to our lessons on intercultural engagement. This lesson is titled The Journey to Intercultural Sensitivity. I want to start with a couple of statements from T.E. Lawrence. T.E. Lawrence was a British intelligence officer in World War I, and he was stationed in the Arabian Peninsula. And his job was to work with the Arabian peoples of that peninsula that were currently being occupied and attacked by the Central Powers being Germany and Austro-Hungary, and they were working in concert with Bulgaria and some of the countries in the Middle East. And so the British intelligence was trying to form up militia groups there in the Arabian Peninsula, and T.E. Lawrence was assigned to that. He had formerly worked out of the Cairo office in Egypt, and he, in working with the Arabian peoples there and trying to form militias as resistance, found himself adapting to the culture in which he was working, and so much so that he was called home by the British Army and accused of going native, and because he was trying to identify with those people so he could work effectively with them. And in his journals, he almost went mad at one point because he had lost his sense of who he was. And he asked these questions. He said, how could I as me meet these people? And how would I have to change? What of me was superficial and could be sacrificed? And what did I need to keep in order to be myself, to remain who I was? And that is a question that, as we interact with other cultures, and especially if we live with another culture, in another culture for a long time, and we begin to adapt to that culture, our identities will change. When two cultures come together in a permanent way, so immigration or migration, when that happens, cultures come together, and when they intersect, they change each other, they affect each other. And we've seen that happen throughout time with numerous people groups. And so that's one of the things we're going to explore here is, one, how do we adapt? How do we become more interculturally sensitive? And then how does that affect our identity? We'll talk a little bit about that. Now, I want to just put this back in front of you because we are plunging into the subconscious or subjective levels of culture here. So remember that this is what we're doing, is we are interacting with those deep level cultural concepts and constructs as we're talking about adaptation and adjustment and identity transformation. Whenever we are going into another culture, there is an inevitable adjustment process. And this is really why the whole field of intercultural relations exists, is because when people from different backgrounds do come together, there's an adjustment process that happens. And initially in that process, we come into contact with somebody who's different from me, and we might expect them to be like us. Or maybe they're not like us, but we don't expect it to be really difficult to interact and to adjust. Sometimes there's different reactions that can occur. We can be fearful, we can be angry, we can be frustrated, we can get weary, and we can have some psychological reactions to that. One, we avoid interaction and we flee, the fight or flight syndrome. A second kind of reaction might be that we become more aware of our reaction. And as we do that, as we become aware of our reaction, now we can reflect on it. And when we begin to reflect, that reaction, the anger or the emotional response tends to subside. We can't hold two different things in mind at the same time. So if we intellectually reflect, the emotional reaction will subside. And then we can reflect more deeply once that emotion goes away, and we begin to observe different aspects of the situation, which then will allow us to develop more culturally appropriate expectations. We've talked about before this idea that uncertainty produces anxiety. And any new situation, there's uncertainty, and our goal is to try to reduce that uncertainty. And there are dysfunctional reactions and then more functional reactions. So in the beginning, we either are going to flight or flee that situation, or we're going to pause and reflect on that situation. In terms of resisting or moving against whatever is happening, we can become aggressive, or we can become assertive, or as we learned in our intercultural competence lesson, we can use social initiative to try to interact with that situation in an open-minded way, in a flexible way, in a way that seeks empathy. And then when we get past some of that anxiety and the emotional response, we can begin moving with the situation. And we can either, in a dysfunctional way, we can either grow dependent on others or on kind of different coping mechanisms that aren't very functional, or we can adapt isomorphic attributions like we talked about in a previous lesson, where I'm learning to say about that situation what the local culture says about it, and then I'm beginning to adjust to that situation. What happens in most cultural interactions where I'm living in a culture or I'm in a long-term stay in a culture is I go through a culture shock cycle. And actually this can happen on shorter term stays as well. Some research suggests that everyone goes through some kind of what they call either culture shock or acculturative stress. As I'm acculturating in a new environment, there are different pressures on me. Language skills that I may be acquiring, or just learning how things are done at this new place that I'm in. And so let's talk through this culture shock cycle, because it's kind of interesting the way we emotionally respond to these different environments. And if you think about that midline there, that's our normal intensity of emotions, kind of how excited or frustrated or depressed we are at any given point in time, on an average day or week. And so when our normal kind of level of emotional response, when we're first thinking about going into a new culture, a new country, going on a trip, it's kind of exotic, maybe exciting, and our intensity of emotions tends to tick up a few levels. And we're anticipating this great time. We're going to Italy, woohoo! We get to see all these new sights and experience new foods and maybe work on a little Italian. And so we're pretty excited about that. And when we first get there, we can be really fascinated. And I've led enough teams abroad to know that everybody is super excited. Everything seems so new, so fresh. I remember one team, we flew into Milan and we're traveling to this southern city in Switzerland, and all the students are looking out the windows of the bus and they're looking at fairly random, normal things that you could even see here in the US, and they're just so jazzed about it. They're commenting on everything, and everything seems so new and so cool. And so there is this fascination phase that we're in where everything is heightened. All of our emotions are heightened and everything is exciting. But then we have to start interacting in that environment. And once you have to start getting work done, or you realize how difficult it is to operate in a second language and nobody understands you and they don't have the kinds of food that you're used to, and you're trying to do normal things like just getting online, and maybe it's done a little bit differently there, or your cell phone doesn't work quite the same way, and so you need a new SIM card, and everything requires an adjustment, right? And it just becomes work. Just living, normal day-to-day operations. You can't operate the laundry machine, everything becomes frustrating. Then we start to have what's called the increasing participation phase, and you can see that emotional intensity begins to take a dive. And when you deal with it long enough, pretty soon you get into the shock phase. And it isn't until you begin learning how to adapt, how things are done, how to operate, how to shop, how to get your groceries, how to use the local transportation system. And as you begin to adapt, your emotional intensity begins to return to normal. And you can see that even once you're at normal, it kind of ebbs and flows on that normal line. You have better days and days that aren't so good, just like you would back home, right? But you've reached that normative emotional cycle again. This shock cycle has a re-entry phase as well. And so when you get ready to return back home, again, you're excited to go home, you're excited to see all these people you haven't seen, you're excited to share your experience, and so that anticipation phase comes back. All that that high level of emotions and excitement comes back. But then you realize you get home and you're maybe more excited to share about your experience than other people are to hear about it. And you realize that they're not so excited, and you've had this life-changing experience, but they didn't. And so they're like, oh, how was your trip? Oh, good, great, that's enough. I want to hear. I don't want to hear anymore. And so people go through that as well. We call it the re-entry cycle. Or re-entry shock. And so that acculturative stress, sometimes you learn some really great skills back on your trip, and in this new culture, you try to bring those back home, and it's hard to adjust. Maybe you got used to long, social, kind of informal meals where you took a long time to eat and socialize, whereas you get back into the US and eating is just about refueling the machine. It's not about a social experience. And so you miss those long, leisurely dinners with your friends. So things like that take some time to get back into once you're back home. And sometimes people want to integrate some of those things from the new culture back into their lives, and that takes work as well for people to understand that you've changed because you had this really amazing experience. So what those stages look like in terms of definitions is the anticipation stage is your preparation for your sojourn. You're building in excitement. You might have regrets or anxieties about, leaving people or what you're going to experience in that new place. So there's a little bit of that anticipation emotion going on. And then, as I mentioned, the fascination stage, where everything is exciting and everything's monumental and everything's novel and new. And then you have to start getting work done, as I said, and frustration can grow, and misunderstandings and confusions, and maybe even embarrassments because you use the language incorrectly, and you can get discouraged. And then finally you reach that shock stage. And Calvero Oberg is a sociologist and psychologist that there were some people that talked about it before he did, but he really brought culture shock into the academic research as a concept. And he said it can actually create medical conditions, as we'll see here in a second. So we have this shock stage, and you might feel incapable or inferior, and things you used to be really competent at, all of a sudden you don't even know how to bag up fruit and pay for it in the grocery store, and people in line behind you are getting frustrated because you did it wrong and they're trying to check out, and so I'm saying things that actually happen to students that I've taken abroad. And so you begin to get depressed, and I've seen that happen with students abroad. They begin to get homesick, and they miss their family and their significant others, and they have a really rough time for a period of time until you begin to get back into it. And here, as we said, you can have functional reactions or dysfunctional reactions, and you can shut down and kind of isolate yourself from everyone, or you can engage and you begin to reflect on what's happening and begin to look for strategies to learn how to adapt to that new place. And so that ultimately becomes, you get into, for a long-term stay, you get into what's called biculturality, where you become a bicultural person. Maybe you can code switch between languages or code switch between different kinds of behavior. And so that is where ultimately we want to be, is in that adaptation stage. So Oberg said that we can have all kinds of symptoms, as you can see here, to our shock or that cultural reaction when we are in the depth of that frustration and depression maybe that's coming from that new cultural environment. And there are, again, all kinds of acculturative stressors that come into our life. Maybe you're in this new place and you don't know how to drive on the other side of the road, and a lot of the vehicles maybe have manual transmissions, and you don't know how to buy the kind of pass you need to ride on the mass transit system, and all of those things come to a fore. And we, even at the height of that, we can lose our sense of identity, because back home we were this competent and engaged and person who was very capable, and in this new place we've lost our friends, we don't have our language that we know how to operate in, and we don't have the skill sets that we used to have because they were all dependent on the familiarity with our cultural environment. So culture shock is a real thing. Acculturative stress is a real thing. It comes in a lot of sizes and varieties, and especially for immigrants or refugees or international students, they can go through serious bouts of depression from the transitions that they've had to go through. So remember that shock, and as you are in your engagement, your intercultural engagement, think about this, especially if you're doing an international trip. Think about this journey that you'll be on and anticipate it. Know that things are going to seem idyllic at the beginning, but then as you have to get work done and accomplish things, you might fall into that shock cycle and that stress cycle, and then think about how you can get yourself out of it. And usually it's by re-engaging with the local scene and making friends and forcing yourself to interact with people from that host culture. So from an acculturation standpoint, somebody who is moving for a good period of time, maybe they're immigrating permanently to a new place, they will have certain orientations toward that culture. They might assimilate entirely, meaning they completely give up their heritage culture and they want to integrate with that new culture entirely. They might marginalize themselves by losing, maybe they don't have anybody from their heritage culture with them in that place, and they don't engage with the host culture, and so they marginalize themselves. Or maybe if they have a strong ethnic heritage culture group in this new place, they completely immerse themselves in that culture and don't interact with the dominant host culture, and so they do a separation mentality. Integration would be the combination. They maintain their heritage culture and an identity, and they integrate with the host culture and make friends with those people in that culture. And so you can see that there's an individual level at which this takes place, but then also a larger group or societal level with which that takes place. And so you can see that happen with ethno-cultural, what used to be called subculture groups in societies, where you have what we call ethnic enclaves, right? So you might have a section of town where a lot of Somali live, and they have halal grocery stores and Somali coffee shops and places where they can buy clothing that is unique to their culture. And malls, the Somali malls in the Twin Cities, there are 3 separate Somali malls with a lot of Somali businesses that can be found there. And so you create these ethnic enclaves, and we might call that kind of a segregation. What we want is a true multicultural society where both groups exist side by side and integrate with one another. The old mentality was that society was a melting pot, and that as these cultures came in, they would blend into whatever the dominant mainstream culture was. And that's less the case in reality, right? We're not a giant melting pot. We really have cultural identities that exist side by side and interact and integrate with one another. And so that's what a multicultural society is. Part of getting to that point of an integrated multicultural society is having the right societal conditions. And so the contact hypothesis, which was first put forward by Gordon Allport and Amir, and they suggested that there were certain conditions that could be put into place where your society would have positive contact with one another. And so you can see these conditions: equal status communication, a common purpose or goal set that you have where you're together trying to accomplish those goals. So there's a mutuality and a cooperation, an interdependency as point number 3. And if you have those, and you have a supportive, social, authoritative government, for instance, support system or government positions and policies in place. And then if you can accomplish somewhat intimate levels of communication and interaction, not superficial sorts of interaction conditions, if you actually have kind of an interleaving of social networks, then you will have positive contact. So on the right hand of the slide, you see some of the ideas behind positive contact. One, acculturative stress is again, culture shock and the stressors that come into play that you experience in that new environment. As we have positive contact with each other, a culture of stress reduces. Majority attitudes toward immigrant groups or groups coming in also will be positive. If you have interdependence that's perceived, you have common mutually desired goals that you need each other's help with, then you're going to have positive intergroup contact. And part of that is dependent on the host culture, that dominant group's receptivity toward the majority group. So majority group attitude makes a big difference on how that new group will be received. To some extent, go back to our frameworks that we talked about. We can anticipate some of these things by looking at the contrasts in things like the Schwartz value set. And we can see that two groups that have diametric or opposing value sets, we can anticipate that there will be some work to do to get them to adjust and to have those cultures become interdependent and work side by side. We also want to be mindful that when somebody comes into a new culture, to some extent, they probably want to preserve some of their home culture or their heritage culture values and behaviors and traditions. And that's very normal and can be very positive too. Having a strong group, heritage culture group or ethnic group in the place that you're going into that you can affiliate with right away actually helps your adjustment early on. But you don't want to just stay inside that heritage group. You have to get out and interact with the larger mainstream or dominant culture group in order to fully adjust and have the best level of adjustment. And part of it is dependent on social network effects. To the extent that I invite others into my social network and make friends with people from that host culture that represent the majority language, the majority or dominant cultural group, then I'm going to have a more positive cultural adjustment from the standpoint of like I'm going to be more employable, I'm going to get better language skills, I'm going to adjust socially better in my neighborhoods and communities if I am integrating my network. If I stay isolated, then I might be somewhat satisfied, but I'm not going to have the most potential and the best kind of adaptation that I could if I don't take advantage of those social network effects by broadening my social network. When we go into another culture, it just almost always entails transition in how I think and behave and the kind of the way that I see the world. We're going to change when we interact with people from other cultures and get to know them and bond with them and become interdependent with them. This is a really important model that talks about and thinks about the development of intercultural sensitivity, which is at the core of that transition, that change. And the model was developed initially by Milton Bennett and Mitch Hammer and Milton and Janet Bennett. And they have this notion of people in this transition and becoming more interculturally sensitive that move from an ethnocentric mindset to an ethno-relative mindset. And others talk about it moving from a monocultural to a multicultural mindset. And if we start from the left in the ethnocentric side of the spectrum, we can see that people begin by denying that cultural differences are really important or even exist to some extent. Most people will recognize that people are different around the world, but they don't think it matters. They think that ultimately their culture is the best and everybody else should do things their way. And so they just deny that cultural differences exist and are important. As you move along in the spectrum, the next point is polarization. This used to be called defense. Sometimes you'll see it talked about and written about in terms of defensive posture. And what it means is that you see cultural differences as problematic, right? So it's polarizing. And so you might become defensive about those differences. Maybe immigrants come into your community and maybe they have a different religion or they approach life differently. They have different clothing styles and you become defensive. And that defensiveness can come from a lot of different places. Maybe you're fearful that they will change your culture. And yes, it probably will ultimately change your culture a little bit. Maybe you're fearful that they will take your job, so there could be an economic fear, or maybe you're fearful about the threat of violence or something that you imagine that culture represents, and so there can be a lot of defensive reasons or reasons for defense. There's kind of an interesting reversal polarization effect in this one too. Let's say that you do go abroad and have an international experience, and when you come back, you've been changed from that experience. It shaped who you are now, and so it can cause sort of a hating on, a reversal effect toward your own culture, your own heritage culture. You think, wow, this other culture is so awesome. Why don't we do it that way? We're so dumb. My heritage culture is kind of backwoodsy. And so you can actually have a reversal polarization effect. The next stage over used to be, it's called minimization, and it used to be thought of as a completely ethnocentric stage, but more recent research suggests that this is really the doorway to ethno-relativism. So minimization says, yes, cultures are different, and I recognize that, but what we really need to do is emphasize similarities. After all, we're all just people. Right? And if we do that, then we can get along better. We need to stop talking about culture. We need to de-emphasize cultural differences. And the problem with that mentality is that when we say, after all, we're all just people, then when we interact with somebody who's different, we really just turn them into ourselves, right? We have to interact with them on some default basis. Like, how are we going to interact? Well, we're going to use my language, and you're going to behave like I expect you to behave. And then when that doesn't happen, we get frustrated, right? We get mad or we get fearful because after all, we do have differences with people, right? There are different value systems and different religions and different ways of dress and different food styles and all kinds of things, some of which we might appreciate, some of which we find problematic. And so that minimization, trying to say, oh, cultures, yes, they exist, but it doesn't matter. What we need to focus on are what we all share in common. And that's important. We do share things in common. There are common denominators that we can look for, but we also have to appreciate who people are, right? What makes you you? And if I devalue that, I take that away from you. And unfortunately, this has been some historic government policy in the past, and they were called assimilation policies. And when people immigrated, they were stripped of their ethnic names and languages and dress and ability to be who they were culturally, and they were forced to become like whatever that government thought was the dominant or mainstream culture. And it was even done to indigenous peoples. For instance, here in the United States, children were taken from their family, put into schools, and were, in a sense, tried to train to become European American, even though they were Native American. And so they were, the government policy was to strip them of their identities. And you can see how problematic and troubling that is. And so that minimization mindset, though, at least recognizes that, hey, there are cultural differences, and I see those differences. When we make the step over into acceptance, we're now in the ethno-relative side of the spectrum. And this is a really important step, because what you've done is you've said, not only are there differences, but I see them for how valuable they are, right? I recognize and appreciate that I can learn something from those differences. And it's like that quotation that I mentioned to you in a previous lesson, that every culture, every people group has something, they know something about God that I don't know. Because if we are all made in God's image, then somehow they might be able to show me a piece of God, some way of approaching God that I don't understand yet. And so that imago Dei, there's something there. If God has made us all in his image, wow, and we're different, and he's let us spring up in these different varieties of language and culture and ways of life, then what can I learn about God by knowing them? And we each have this treasure that as we share it, we can come together someday in Revelation 5 and Revelation 7, worshiping the Lamb together in every tribe, every tongue, every language before the throne. And so that beginning stage of seeing that is acceptance. That I say, hey, wow, there's something here that's pretty cool and I want to know more. Ultimately, as we learn more and become more skilled, we learn some second language, we learn how to change and modify our behavior or more mindset and think in different ways. Maybe I don't just think individualistically, I'm able to think in a collectivistic way, or I flip from low context to high context. And as I'm able to do that, now I can move into the adaptation, where I don't just think or know that there are differences and appreciate them, but I'm actually able to use some skills to operate differently in different cultural settings. The last stage is no longer thought of as a developmental stage. It is an identity stage that people have. So in terms of development, we stop with that fifth stage, adaptation. But once somebody becomes truly bicultural, and they can code switch between languages and between behaviors, and they've actually adopted some things into their identity, and they become bicultural or multicultural, that then is integration. And so the most recent research by Mitch Hammer and his associates has teased out that is really an identity stage and not a developmental stage that people go through. So we'll stop there with that model. Now, I've overlaid that model of the DMIS that Bennett talked about in your reading with a communication model. Why did I do that? All of these stages, we work through these stages through communication, through interaction with people. This is not going to happen with you sitting alone in your room. We will interact with people, and that coming together over periods of time, sharing our fields of experience, and we each have these different fields of experience, but there's eventually going to be an overlap where we connect, and it's in that space of connection where we learn to negotiate those intercultural spaces, and we can begin to grow in our intercultural sensitivity. And as we grow in our intercultural sensitivity, we become more competent, we become more effective. I'm going to give you some statements, and I want you to try to tell me what stage does that seem to reflect. So if somebody says, when I'm in a foreign country, all I really need to know is how to get back to my hotel if I get lost. What stage do you think that is? I'm going to pause for a second and give you a chance to try to say, oh, that's that stage. If you said denial, you're absolutely right. See, this person says cultural differences aren't really important, right? I know I'm in a foreign country, but if I get lost, here's what I need is the address to my hotel. I don't really need to know how to get along in that culture or understand those differences. That's not important. If they say, why do we always have to emphasize what makes people different? People are people, after all. What stage does that reflect? If you said minimization, you're absolutely right. You see how they try to find that common denominator, and when I do that, I'm still implicitly making people out in my own image, right? I'm saying, oh, who you are, your language, your cultural differences, those aren't really important. What we really need to do is just recognize that we're people, and that's what's important. But when I say people, I mean my people, right? So that's the problem with that stage. When I travel abroad, it makes me realize how much better things are in the US. What stage? That's right, polarization or defense, because they're kind of, in a sense, hating on the culture that they're in, or that new culture that's come into their culture. My life is enriched by my relationships with people from different backgrounds and experiences. What stage does that reflect? If you said acceptance, you're absolutely right. See, the difference between acceptance and adaptation, this person doesn't say, I can change my behavior. It just says, I see the value in it. I'm enriched. I'm curious. I'm excited to learn about those different things. I appreciate that we have differences, but in the end, we have to cooperate in order to get along. So we should focus on what we have in common. That's right. That's another minimization phrase. So you can see how these stages on the Bennett and Hammer model, the DMIS model, are really like a bell curve. And minimization is the biggest section of people. About 65% of people fall into that minimization category. The defensive or polarization category or stage, about 14.5% of people fall into that stage. And only about 3% are in the denial stage. Fortunately, there's not very many people in that stage. And likewise, when we get over into the acceptance stage, about 15% of people are also in that stage. So you can see how within one standard deviation, that's about the most people, minimization, then we get into that second standard of deviation from the bell curve, and then that's going to be our defensive or our acceptance stage. And then that last tail, 3 standard of deviations out, that's when we're getting into the adaptation and the denial folks. So what if somebody said, I usually try to behave appropriately in intercultural situations, but I also can still maintain my values and beliefs? That's right. The key here is behave. I can behave appropriately. That means I've learned how to adapt in that cultural setting. And what I want you to realize here is when you adapt, this does not mean you give up who you are. Yes, you're asking those same questions that T.E. Lawrence had to ask of how do you have to change? What do you have to preserve to be you, and what can you give up to modify in order to get along in this new place that you're in? And so that's adaptation, when you realize how you need to code switch and how you can move back and forth fluidly between those different cultures. And sometimes there's this idea of identity hybridization that actually happens. So missionary kids, for instance, they grow up bilingual. If they grew up in Ecuador and they're bilingual in English and Spanish, and when they come back to the States, they find that they exist in this third culture status of they're not fully U.S. American, but they're not fully Ecuadorian either. They're a third culture person. And so that hybrid identity, a lot of people occupy that sort of identity reality. A really important concept related to intercultural competence and the development of intercultural sensitivity is the notion of mindfulness. In fact, in the Bennett's DMIS model, mindfulness is a key concept because we all start out fairly unconscious of our incompetence in another culture. And so we're pretty naive. We don't know what we don't know. Once we get into that new cultural environment, we become very conscious of our incompetence. And this happens to my students when I take them abroad. So for instance, we go to Switzerland and they go grocery shopping the first time. And they go into one of the Swiss grocery stores and they pick out their fruit. And they just take the fruit and they throw it in a bag. And then they get to the checkout counter and the clerk gets mad at them and the people behind them get mad at them because in the Swiss grocery store, you have to weigh and produce a price tag for your fruit right there at the fruit stand. And so you can't just throw it in a bag, tie it up, and take it to the checkout clerk. They won't weigh it for you there. They won't price it there. It's priced at the fruits where you pick the fruit out. And if you don't do that, then the clerk has to go back and they've got to weigh it and they've got to print the sticker and put it on there and everybody has to wait for you. And so you realize very quickly that there are things that you don't know and you feel super stupid, very incompetent. The good side of that is that you become more aware of what you need to learn, right? So there's some self-awareness that's happening. Then you move into the learning phase where you begin to become consciously competent. You learn how to use some of your Italian, or you learn how to use some of your German or your Spanish, and you learn how things are done in that new place. So new behaviors and how to interact with people and how to get work done, right? And so sometimes that happens through just trial and error. Sometimes you, maybe gain a friend, what we call a cultural liaison, who helps you kind of navigate those waters. Sometimes you're mentored in it, or you take a class, through language classes and things like that. And ultimately, after a long time, it becomes second nature and you become unconsciously competent. You just know how to do certain things in that new environment. Those are the stages of mindfulness. Now, mindfulness suggests that we are in an ongoing state of reflective competence. And so research suggests that conscious competence is really the best place to be. Yes, there are some things that are going to become unconscious and second nature, but we still have to be mindful that we are always going to be growing in that process, right? In learning more about that culture. And so being mindful is a good present state to be in. We don't ever want to be unmindful. Yes, we want to be able to use the language fluently without having to think too much about it, but we still want to be mindful that it's not my first language and I always have more to learn in that scenario because I didn't grow up in it. And things like using humor or innuendo, things that we say that in terms of using the language, sometimes it's learning how to use humor or understand humor in a second language is really hard. Or sometimes innuendo is also really hard to figure out. And so that constant process of learning is going to be an ongoing thing. So just remember, mindfulness is a really important concept in our journey toward intercultural sensitivity. And as we mentioned before, isomorphic attributions are the goal, where we say about something that they would say, that new culture that we're in would say about it. And if you remember from one of your readings, the blind spot reading, we can look at the same object and see it very differently, even though it is the same object. And so perception, that isomorphic attributions is all about perceptions. And so when we are beginning to grow in our ability to make isomorphic attributions, there's some benefits that come about from that. One is we have a greater understanding of the host culture as judged by the hosts themselves. In a sense, they're going to be proud of us or kind of impressed by our fluency in the culture and how we're able to get along. There's also going to be a decrease inside of kind of the dark side of culture and the use of negative stereotypes. We'll begin to be able to think more complexly about the culture. We're going to adjust better. We're going to have fewer stresses in life, and we're going to have more enjoyment in our process there. And then we're also going to just be able to get work done more effectively. Things we used to be competent in back home will also be competent in this new place. And there will also be some identity changes that will happen. As I mentioned, as we interact with other cultures, it changes who we are. As you gain a fluency in a second language or in the behaviors and processes of a new culture, there's a psychological process that you'll go through where you will begin to decategorize that out group, and you will begin to recategorize them and restructure your cultural boundaries and your perceptual boundaries and form new, what are called superordinate identities, where you and that other culture will find these intersecting points, these identities that overlap. Now, there's a model called the cultural mosaic model that talks about how that happens, because we all kind of organize our identities around different demographic characteristics like our age and our sex and things that are demographic, maybe our region that we come from, geographic categories, our nationality, our state. And then we also have associative groups that we are members of. So I'm a professor, I'm a soccer player, I'm a member of certain organizations, and being a student is an associative group that you perhaps are a part of. And so you have these different call them tiles, as the cultural mosaic model suggests, in our identity. And a superordinate identity is a tile that you and that culture that you're in can interact on, and you can connect on that superordinate identity. And you can see how some of these identity tiles will begin to shift as you de-emphasize or decategorize an identity that the other group has, recategorize as a shared identity, and create a superordinate identity. That will help you begin to interact more smoothly with that other culture. And frankly, your identities will change a little bit as you have lots of different cultural experiences and as your social network begins to become more heterogeneous, right? You will integrate people from other cultures and backgrounds into your social network, and those friendships will change how you see yourself and how you see others. So that's a really important thing to understand. Is on my journey toward intercultural sensitivity, my identity will change a little bit, how I see myself. And for instance, a superordinate identity tile for many of you might be being a Christian. And as you connect with other Christians from different backgrounds and understand how they worship the Lord a little bit differently than you do, that might broaden your understanding of the kingdom of God. So we had some misleading assumptions as we came into this journey. And one of those might be that the world is homogeneous, right? The homogeneity myth. The melting pot was one of the things that I talked about, that we used to think of the world or our community, our society as a melting pot, that we're all essentially the same. That's that minimization mindset. Not true. Or a parochialism assumption that there's only one way to do things. Our way is the only way, and we don't see another way of living, working, being. Ethnocentrism, our way is the best way, right? That when we're all, trust me, we're all around the world ethnocentric. We talked about that one of the very first lessons, and all other ways are inferior to ours. If they would all just be like us, the world would be a better place. Misleading assumption. And then the similarity myth, that they, whoever they are all just like me, similar to the homogeneity myth. So this similarity that we all have. If we start from the basis of difference, we talked about how important that is, then we can begin to build on empathy. So what's happening in your process is that you began by trying in this kind of frozen cultural mindset. And we began by suggesting, or the process that you unfreeze that, right? You're going to decategorize the other and let that person be who they are. And then you're going to have some shifts in your understanding, shifts in how you interact with people and the way you will be able to adapt your behavior, and the way you understand other people, the way you understand the need for intercultural interaction, right? That our world is increasingly diverse and globalizing, and we are increasingly interdependent with each other. And so we need to understand how to interact more smoothly. And then as we move into what might be a refreezing stage, where now we are adaptive and we can move amongst cultures because we understand cultural differences, how to adapt our behavior to have, for instance, intercultural or interfaith conversations where we can still show respect and dignity. So all of that leads to more appropriate assumptions that the world is a pluralistic, heterogeneous place, that there are similarities and differences, that there are multiple ways to get to the same outcome, right? Raising children, there are lots of different ways to raise children, educating people, producing certain kinds of work or products. There are different ways of doing things. And that our way is just one possible way amongst many ways of doing things. And as we grow in that, I think you will find that you'll have a lot more fun on your intercultural journey as we begin to learn how to be sensitive to other cultures and how to adapt. I want you to reflect on these ideas and think about how what we've talked about extends your way of thinking and knowing the world and others. We'll see you at the next lesson.